I hope you've enjoyed our presentation so far this session. We'll now move on to a panel discussion where Ali McInroy from Technology Scotland will engage with some of our previous contributors to pull out a couple of key themes that will be important to get right if we're to achieve our aspirations in this sector. Ali, over to you.
Okay, welcome everybody to this final panel discussion to close off this afternoon's transport session. My name is Ali McInroy. I'm the CEO at Technology Scotland. We are the representative body for Scotland's enabling technology sector. Among other things, but particularly relevant to today's discussion, we manage the Mass Scotland Network, which is a network of 75 public and private sector organisations who share a vision to develop, demonstrate and deploy mobility as a service solutions in Scotland, a model that is very much crucial in our efforts to promote the modal shift and change in transport behaviours that I think we'll all agree are required to meet our net zero ambitions. I'll be facilitating what will be around a 25-minute discussion, delving in a bit more detail into some of the topics that we've already highlighted earlier on in this session. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts who will help guide us through some of the key considerations when addressing our ambitions of both transport decarbonisation, but also of just transition. These will be faces familiar to you if you've been with us for the duration of this session so far, but just by way of brief reintroduction, I guess, our panellists this afternoon are John Birtwistle, who's Head of Policy at First Bus, Sarah Petrie, who's Innovation Director at MSIP, Matt Eastwood, who's Head of Innovation and Supply Chain at the Low Carbon Economy Directorate within Transport Scotland, and Jacqueline Redmond, who is the Executive Director at PNDC. Welcome, everybody. So, over the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to tease out some of our panellists' experience and expertise in areas from inclusivity through to skills development and innovation. So, welcome to the panel. Thank you for participating this afternoon. First off, I want to touch on the Scottish Government's strong focus on just transition, which we've heard a lot about over the course of today. This is obviously a multifaceted vision because it covers so many different sector areas, but I'm interested to get your take on what you believe just transition means in terms of future transport delivery particularly, and any key considerations or barriers that you see to achieving this in relation to decarbonising transport. So I want to use that as a kind of kick-off of discussions. John, if I could come to you first on that question.
Thanks, Ali. Hello, everybody. So this is a really important issue. We need to ensure that the benefits are maximised. So I would like you to consider two alternative situations. One, where the requirements for providing electrical charging points for private cars across new developments, across new housing, in town and city centres, in country areas, are all fulfilled. And we end up with a decarbonised transport fleet comprising as many cars as we have today, causing the same amount of congestion, causing the same amount of localised air pollution from things like particulates from tyres and brakes, causing severance, causing visual intrusion, and not available to the entirety of society. Alternatively, we have got a situation whereby achieving modal shift in step with decarbonisation, we maximise the benefits. So we have a transport system that is available to all, including those who are unable to drive, who don't want to drive, who can't afford a car or don't have access to a car. We have a public transport system that maximises the efficient use of the limited road space available and therefore maximises the economic benefits derived from decarbonisation. And that way we are actually getting the best value out of a decarbonised transport system, one that is socially equitable, maximises the economic potential and maximises the environmental benefits. So utopia rather than dystopia, I would suggest.
Thanks, John. It's a nice summary of that. But I think it does highlight the complexity of the question that I've asked, that there are many elements to that, which we'll be able to touch on, hopefully, as this panel session progresses. Sarah, if I could come to you on the same question.
I think that was a really interesting way of framing it. John, thank you for that, and thank you, Ali, for coming to me next. I guess from our perspective at Michelin Scotland Innovation Park, we're keen to see the uptake of zero emission vehicles in every walk of life, whether that's cars, buses, HGVs, or when possible, potentially electric scooters. And I guess from the perspective of the just transition, we want to make sure that people have an equal access to mobility that allows them to go about their daily life, to get their shopping, to take the kids to school, without unnecessarily impacting disadvantaged groups more than others. So I think the ability to look at the energy mix that's available, the vehicle mix that's available, and the other modes of transport, and encouraging more active transport and travel, as well as just encouraging people to shift from internal combustion engines to electric engines, I think is a really interesting piece to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think what's coming through from these first two answers is that there's not one solution to this, obviously, and simply moving to electric vehicles, for example, doesn't provide the solutions that we're looking for, and there is a sort of toolkit of responses that are going to need to form part of our future transport delivery. Matt, keen to get your thoughts on this, particularly from a Transport Scotland perspective.
Thanks, Ali. The Scottish Government was one of the first countries in the world to acknowledge that there was a climate emergency, and we have statutory targets for reducing carbon emissions in Scotland. And if that's the what, the how is a just transition. And what that means in practice is the provision of skills and training for the people of Scotland to ensure that they can benefit from high value green jobs in sectors such as manufacturing, renewables, and also technology. It means job security in those sectors that are leading the way in decarbonising. It means that when we invest in infrastructure, we invest in infrastructure that supports decarbonisation, and also addresses some of the challenges we might face in terms of the negative impacts of climate change as well. So it provides us with a level of security against, what could potentially be quite disruptive impacts in terms of weather changes. But it also means making the costs of that transition, the burden of paying for that transition, not landing on those least able to pay. And it also means that we ensure that the benefits of that transition to net zero are spread across society so that we all benefit from that transition.
Thanks, Matt. A really interesting response, because I think, you've highlighted it's not simply about access to transport necessarily in terms of this transition. You're talking there about jobs, about infrastructure, and of course ultimately about the economic benefits being shared equally and through society. I think is all within that wider context of just transitions. I think is really important. So just to kind of close out this kind of initial piece, Jacqueline, I'd like to come to you on this same question around just transition.
Okay, thanks very much, Ali. There's two elements around this. There's the modal shift, and there's also the skills element. I think that one of the things for me about the just transition is that we're on the verge of a major change, say, in the bus sector, with looking at hydrogen vehicles and battery vehicles getting deployed in the cities of Scotland. Our trains have significantly more electrified journeys than elsewhere in the UK, and I know that Transport Scotland is looking at the hydrogen train and looking at sort of hybrid models as well that can be used in areas where electrification just doesn't make sense. So that's all good. The problem is, I think, in the aviation sector, that is slower to decarbonise, and that's where the just transition becomes a bit stuck, because what we've got is regular flying being the privilege of the rich almost, and that is the regular polluting will become the privilege of the rich. So I think we need to give more focus to the aviation sector. And I think it's a great opportunity in Scotland actually to develop and strengthen our aviation sector. And I know that the Highlands and Islands Airport authorities are running a project just now that will look at short flights that will be done carbon free, and that's great. That's certainly a first in the UK. So I think there's lots of exciting opportunities ahead for us in Scotland to be able to manage that just transition. Coming back to the skills, this is a really interesting point because there's been an economic study that says, Scotland as a whole will benefit ultimately from this transition. Now, it's easy to talk about that on averages, and the trouble is that getting to there are going to be people who are going to be out of a job or who will need to reskill. And I think it's great that MSIP have a skills programme as part of their initiative, and NMIS in the West is a skills programme, because I think we need to help. If we're going to get all these electric vehicles on the road, we need to make sure that everybody, whether it's in a conurbation or the rural areas, have access to skilled mechanics, or do you call them mechanics after when it's less mechanical, to be able to keep the EVs on the road. So I think there's two elements the government needs to be looking at, is this accessibility to green transport and ensuring that we've got the right skills to make sure that we can actually go ahead with our targets.
That's brilliant, Jack, and it really nicely sets up where I was hoping to get this panel next, which was to talk around that the future skills kind of agenda, because much of what we're talking about is ultimately sort of technology and innovation fueled, and that usually necessitates a need for upskilling and reskilling in certain areas. So I'm interested in a couple of things actually, and Sarah, I'm going to come to you first on this one, but it's almost a two-part question. The first one is, do we feel that we have a good understanding of those future skills requirements at the moment relating to our future transport delivery? And assuming that we do, or we're working on that, how do we then address these kind of future skills gaps? And I know from your presentation earlier on, obviously you introduced the MSIP Skills Academy, and I've got a big focus on that. So I'd be interested to get your take on how we manage that future skills demand.
Okay, thanks, Ali. I guess the skills piece is, as we've all touched on, a really critical part of the whole just transition. And if we're looking at the creation of new jobs and new skilled jobs, we need to make sure that we have the capacity to deliver those, and also the capabilities. So in terms of what we're doing at Michelin Scotland Innovation Park, we're working very closely with the local college, Dundee and Angus College, and other colleges and universities across Scotland, as well as Skills Development Scotland, to try and identify where some of those gaps might sit. And understanding those gaps is quite a challenge at this point in time, since we actually don't necessarily know exactly where the future is going. We can see so far in the future, which helps us identify potential skills needs in the next 3 to 5 year period. But beyond that, who knows at this point in time? That it's an ongoing piece of work and an ongoing evolution in terms of the skills mix. And Skills Development Scotland is a critical part of that kind of planning process. In terms of rolling it out, we're working very closely with companies to understand what do they need in the next year to 2 years in terms of their skills, and how do we help support them to bring those skills into their workforce. So the Skills Academy is a critical part of our offering, links directly into the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland and other organisations as well. So there is a pan-Scotland piece looking at how do we address that skills requirement. It is critical that we understand from a company perspective what they foresee the future skills needs are going to be, and help them articulate what they're going to be, so that we can make sure that the programmes are in place to address those in the future.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think it's a valid point that the number of variables ahead of us can sometimes make that, identifying that skills demand, I guess, a bit more difficult than perhaps we would like. But it's encouraging to hear that there are so many stakeholders involved in that process, along, of course, with industry as well. John, I'm really interested in that same question from an operator perspective, because you guys, almost more than anyone else, are going to have to, I guess, adjust to that change in skills demand over the next decade or so. So is that something that First Bus are looking at? Well, I assume they are looking at that specifically, but how are you approaching that?
Okay, so by the time this presentation is live, we will have in Glasgow a fleet of 24 single-deck electrically powered vehicles, which is the first stage in our electrification of our Caledonia depot, which ultimately has got capacity for 400 vehicles. So it's a massive project. In fact, we'll be up to 150 electric vehicles in 12 months' time running from Caledonia. So an awful lot of people have got to be trained to look after these, both from an engineering perspective, but also from a driving perspective, because electric buses are slightly different to drive than internal combustion engine vehicles. In parallel to that, we've now got 15 double-deck hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in operation in Aberdeen, and they'll be joined by a few more in the next 12 months or so as well. And again, it's a different technique, particularly from an engineering perspective. Specialised skills, which are pretty much unique to the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, have to be deployed there. We are fortunate in that this is not our first experience of the use of such vehicles. So this is the fourth phase of hydrogen fuel cell vehicle deployment within First Bus. And we've got electrically powered vehicles operating in various of our other operating subsidiaries. And in fact, I've had two in Glasgow now for, I think it's almost 3 years. So we are gradually training our engineering staff and our driving staff to work with these vehicles. We're working with the manufacturers of the vehicles. Clearly, they've got a great deal of expertise, and we can draw upon our experience from elsewhere within First Bus. But besides that, we need to think about those other parties who are involved in the delivery of decarbonisation. I'm thinking particularly in terms of training within our partners who work in the local authorities and indeed in the Scottish Government to ensure that we can secure these benefits across the whole spectrum of bus operation in Scotland in due course. We need to think about rural bus services and how they can be planned and accommodated in terms of powering them, whether it's an opportunity recharge in the middle of the day, a longer, slower recharge during a layover period, or extending the range of hydrogen vehicle operation. We also need to work with our partners in the power supply industries. So in terms of electricity, working with the national grid suppliers, with the local electricity distribution network operators, and ensuring that links into depot premises, links into bus stations, shared charging facilities are all available, are all with sufficient capacity to achieve the charging, but also are available at the right time of day. When the bus arrives at the bus station needing an intermediate charge, there isn't something already parked on the charging stand, particularly a diesel vehicle or a service vehicle or something that doesn't need a charge. So there is a whole wide spectrum of organisations involved in this process, all of whom need to work in partnership and coordination to ensure that we can deliver a decarbonised public transport system for Scotland as rapidly as we possibly can.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's interesting that you've highlighted there, beyond the skills problem, the kind of logistical and infrastructure problems, perhaps, that are challenges that come alongside this transition to a decarbonised fleet from an operator perspective. So I find that fascinating. Matt, I'm going to come to you now and to Transport Scotland's perspective in this. There are a few, obviously, who have quite that holistic view over transport, the way that Transport Scotland does. But I wonder how you could manifest that in terms of your approach to skills or your thoughts around future skills agenda.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. So Scotland's Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan provides an overarching framework for identifying the gaps, challenges and opportunities around the skills that we need in order to secure a just transition to net zero. But there's also a lot of work going on across different sectors of the Scottish economy to identify the skills gaps as they exist now and as they'll exist in the future, as Sarah alluded to. And I think that, an example of that is, Transport Scotland's working closely with the Skills Agency for Scotland, Skills Development Scotland, specifically looking at the gaps around transport. And we're also working with the College Sector Agency, ESP, to support the development and rollout of skills delivered through Scotland's further education colleges around both electric and hydrogen vehicles, so specifically to address some of those gaps and create opportunities for both current and future, both mechanics and fitters, to have the skills they need to maintain and repair the types of vehicles that we will need to see, that we are seeing and we will need to see on our roads in the future in order to ensure that we meet our net zero targets.
Great, thanks, Matt. I think that's a good way to sort of just tie up our discussion there around skills. But as I said before, really encouraging to hear that there are so many organisations and stakeholders who are paying particular attention, because I know when in previous conversations I've had that skills is often identified as being one of the key challenges to this, actually, that we are going to have a future skills problem potentially if we don't begin to explore what we need to do at this stage. So it is encouraging, as I say, to see so much work being done in this area. I want for the final sort of third of this panel, if I may, is to sort of take us down the innovation and technology route, an area very close to my own heart for obvious reasons, given the organisation I represent. But we like to claim, and I think rightly in Scotland, that we are a nation of innovators. I think we've earned that reputation over centuries, and I think in certain areas in particular we can still claim to be just that. But my question then is, from a just transition perspective, it's a bit of a twofold question. Apologies, I do like a twofold question. One is, how do we continue to nurture that in Scotland and to nurture, technology and innovation developments, particularly in relation to transport, but then also do so in such a way that does support that overriding goal for just transition? Because as we know, technology, as great as it is and can do so many great things, it can also be a barrier. And depending on how we manage that, it can create unintended consequences in terms of the accessibility and inclusivity agenda that will be part of that just transition. So, Jacqueline, I wonder if I could come to you on that question first, around how we begin to do that, how we begin to strike that balance, I guess.
I think what I find really interesting about working in the Scottish sector is how closely Scottish government agencies such as Transport Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, industry and academia all work so well together, mutually sort of reinforcing each other. I mean, Sarah and Matt and I are working together on a project based in Dundee called Locate in partnership with St Andrews. And that will be looking at developing skills and developing a new capability to test heavy duty vehicles that will be going through sort of the green transition and developing the skills around that. So I think, how do we nurture it? I think we just all keep working closely together and understanding each other's objectives. I think, for whatever reason, we're truly blessed in Scotland to have such a population that continually push the government and push the academic world to innovate in this area. We talked earlier about these organised skills programmes. I also see it coming up from the bottom up, from the employees themselves demanding that their organisation takes action. There's a great organisation called Fuel Change, who every year will set challenges for young apprentices or young folk early in their career, to think about how they can bring green transition, and they have a lot of focus on the transport sector, into their own business. And this has actually been pushed through by these young people trying to find a sustainable business opportunity out of the green transition. So I think, how do we keep it going? I think we continue to, and this sounds so easy to say, but we continue to listen to each other, and we continue to nurture the young folk with ideas, not necessarily through the traditional routes of universities, but through other non-traditional routes, because I think we've got such a challenge, everybody needs to contribute to it.
Yeah, and I'd agree wholeheartedly. I think from my experience in working in the innovation ecosystem in Scotland, it is a very engaged ecosystem. It's a very collaborative ecosystem. So I think that is a genuine asset to us. And I really liked your point about the younger generation sort of driving a lot of that as well, which I think is an excellent point. Sarah, obviously at MSIP, you come across innovation and innovative companies on literally on a daily basis. I'm sure you see some great stuff in the sustainable mobility field, and MSIP again is a genuine asset for that. So is that, in terms of the context of just transition, is that something that you guys are sort of acknowledge when you're as part of the innovation focus there?
Absolutely. It's 100% square and centre of what we're trying to do and achieve. And it's one of the first parts of the conversation we have with any companies that are looking to locate to MSIP. We're very keen that companies have one mind to the kind of fair work agenda and the just transition and the climate emergency. And every company without exception that we speak to is absolutely aligned with us in our thinking there. So absolutely, it's something that we're very keen to support and deliver. I guess some of the things I would actually wholeheartedly back everything that Jacqueline said in her commentary around organisations in Scotland being very prepared to work together and collaboratively. For the greater good, dare I say, but also the role of young people in this whole space. And what I'd like to bring to the table around innovation isn't necessarily around the technology innovation, because we do see that every day. It's something that people do talk about. But other forms of innovation, such as financial innovation, business model innovation, and kind of disruptive technologies that change the way that business is done. And we've talked about the modal shift that's going to be required. And I think that's just going to be driven by and be supported by these new business models that are coming forward. So how do companies make money out of this modal shift? And the first uptakers of a lot of this are going to be the younger generations. They're going to drive this. So it's critically important that we bring them on board. And it's actually probably them that's going to drive it rather than us kind of bringing them on board with our thinking. So I'm just kind of throwing that into the conversation rather than talking about technical innovations. I think there's all sorts of other types of innovations we need to be aware of and bring into the mix.
No, I think that's a really good point. And obviously, as a strong proponent of mobility as a service through some of the work that we look at, I mean, that's effectively a disruptive business model. It has a technological backbone to it, but it's effectively a disruptive business model that is doing exactly that, and it's there to support that modal shift. And I also agree with, again, the drive coming from the younger generation, where we are already beginning to see evidence of changes in the way that they consume transport, moves away from ownership models towards service-based models and others. So I think that's a really important point as well. John, if I could come to you next, because again, innovation, I would assume would be at the heart of a lot of what you guys are doing at First Bus. As well, and there's been some good examples I know that you set out in your session earlier on. But what is the approach there, and what drives innovation for you guys? Is it purely a commercial operation for you, or is there something wider than that?
Well, there has to be something wider than that, because we're looking at the improvements to our community as a whole, the community not just within Scotland, not just within the UK. These are worldwide issues we're dealing with, and therefore we have to have responsibility for them, joint and shared with our partners, and we all have to play our part. Now, just listening to the last few answers to this question, it seems to me that this very much plays into one of the objectives that we're interested in, which is bringing together the lifestyle changes that people are experiencing as we hopefully rapidly now emerge from the COVID pandemic, in terms of changes to employment, changes to shopping, changes to leisure, and even changes to the way that where people choose to live and whether they do choose to travel. Tying that into the younger generation and the education element, and also into the mobility as a service element, and the provision of public transport, and maximising all these by developing a means whereby we can first of all educate people as to the costs of the journeys that they're making, both the internal costs, the true internal costs, representing all those elements that people don't think about, like car maintenance, car depreciation, car taxation, as well as the obvious cost of fuel and parking, and travel time, and the external costs, the impact of their journey, both on the environment through reduction of carbon and locally through airborne pollution, but also the impact on congestion. People cause congestion themselves. They do not just sit there as innocent victims of it, and that congestion has a cost. So first of all, educating people as to all these different elements of the cost of their journey, then beginning to give them information on the different elements of the journey through clever systems such as mobility as a service, journey planners, etc. And then ultimately working with local and national government to actually influence people's behaviour, where there is a public transport alternative, to actually encourage them to use that, whether that is through means such as road user charging, congestion charging, dynamic parking pricing, or whether it is done through incentives, through some sort of supported, incentivized, low-cost public transport that can be used in combination. A carrot and a stick usually works best when used together in a sort of intelligent and informed way. So it's educate, inform, and then influence is the way forward. But there are other elements to this, and if I just very briefly touch upon them, technology and innovation. A lot of major transport operators, both goods and public transport, will have charging facilities that are going to be out of use for large periods of the day when the fleet is out on the road. And those times are potentially going to complement other sectors of the transport industry. So making charging facilities available to other users at the times when they're not in use by their owners is a good use of what will be inevitably expensive resources. And the other area of innovation, which is now beginning to emerge, both in Scotland and First Bus is working in Oxfordshire to develop a similar trial, is autonomous vehicles, to extend the range of public transport beyond that where currently it is limited by the costs of resources, and assessing people's attitudes to and acceptance of autonomous transport as part of the public transport network, pushing public transport further into remote rural areas, for instance, or into the detailed road networks of suburban housing, where it is simply infeasible to provide a sustainable public transport service otherwise.
Thanks, John. And I was fortunate enough to have John in a panel session yesterday where we used that, educate, inform, influence mantra, which I think is brilliant, and I intend to steal regularly over the coming months. So we're rapidly running out of time, but Matt, I want to get your perspective on innovation before we close off. So maybe if you could briefly give it your take on that, particularly as I say from a Transport Scotland perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So innovation is fundamentally a collective endeavor. There's a key role to be played by the private sector, academic sector, and also the public sector as well. When the United States landed a man on the moon in 1969, they harnessed the expertise of all these sectors to support innovation. And they used, public sector spending to drive innovation in the private sector and in the academic sector as well. And the benefits of that innovation existed, well beyond, the achieving the goal of landing a man on the moon. And we really need to look at the challenge that we face in Scotland in terms of decarbonising transport in a similar way, taking a mission-based approach, harnessing the innovation opportunities across all the sectors, and looking at the long-term benefits of that innovation and the potential to ensure a just transition by creating opportunities for Scotland's supply chain, for companies in Scotland, for academic institutions in Scotland, and to create high-value green jobs in Scotland so that we can maximise the benefits of achieving a just transition.
Thanks, Matt. And I think that's actually a really good way to sort of pull this session together when we talk about that partnership working at the end, and in particular that public-private partnership that I think is going to be so crucial, particularly in an area like transport, where really that separation becomes more difficult. And I think to have those key stakeholders all involved is going to be absolutely crucial. Okay, we have rapidly run out of time. As expected, we've only really just managed to kind of scratch the surface of these areas, but that was always going to be the case. But really appreciate your input to it. So thank you all for joining the panel session. But I will now draw that to a close, and I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of today's event. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali, for hosting that thought-provoking discussion, and thanks to all our contributors today. I think if I can summarise the key themes for this session, it would be, first off, technology. We're on the right track, but we can't let up with the innovation to drive down costs to enable the transition to benefit everyone and make it that fair and just transition you've heard a lot about today. In addition, there's a huge issue around skills. Whether it's retraining vehicle mechanics to service hydrogen vehicles and EVs, or plumbers to install heat pumps, this will be quite a task to get the right workforce at the right place at the right time. However, it's also a great opportunity to once again encourage STEM careers for girls and boys and demonstrate how these careers help contribute to the energy transition. But finally, I think the toughest challenge we have ahead is this behavioural change. We have to accept each of us will need to adapt our behaviours, be it avoiding travelling altogether or changing the mode of travel. To encourage more people onto public transport, we need to make sure that it's reliable, fast and affordable. This is probably the hardest challenge to deliver, as you can't simply fund a programme to make it happen. And it's why each and every one of us listening today needs to make a commitment to change our own ways and hope that others follow. Thank you.